Great stuff on the quarterback. So texted Seth, and he's willing to come on and hang out with us for a few minutes, trying to get to the heart of the most interesting position in all of sports, the quarterback position.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. But, I wrote this book for anyone who's played quarterback, who used to play quarterback, and who's been fascinated by it. And, what I wanted to do with it, my goal was to show what it's like at all these different stages, from first picking up a football to being a retired Hall of Famer and everything in between. And I wanted to get the realest glimpse that I could of what it's like to do it, both the ways that it's thrilling and cool as hell, the way that it's, can be cruel and there's folly involved. And I think that, so it follows a bunch of guys, and it tells a bunch of guys' stories within that who are not exactly main characters. And, again, I think that, you have to hardwire yourself to make it through this winnowing process from 16,000 starting quarterbacks every year in America to 4 who make it into the Hall of Fame. And, once you've done that, how you deal with those, with the way that you've wired yourself, I think is really, really fascinating. But, Arch Manning's in there as a way to tell the entire story about the Mannings, Warren Moon, Elway, famous people who are no longer with us, like Johnny Unitas, and obviously, people that you might get to know, like Colin Hurley, who was a really young quarterback, ended up at Louisiana State last year as a 16-year-old freshman, wanted to be on the fast track to everything quarterback, had a horrible accident last year where he ran his car into a tree, nearly died, and, thankfully he came out okay. So, again, it's a dangerous road that I think a lot of these quarterbacks lead with very little guidance, but I wanted, again, just to try to show it and try to let people in on this very fascinating and very uniquely American job.
Why did you tackle this story, Seth? Because lots of books have been written about quarterbacks through the years. What was the impetus? What was the lead for you to try to do something not done before?
Because I'm not like you. Because I played quarterback in high school, and I was a failed quarterback. I didn't, I couldn't do this. And it's not I played in Alaska, so the book is not a morass of my failed career. I'm not Alaska's Uncle Rico, but it is about an unending curiosity. What would have life been like if I had made it? And through all these stories, I did a podcast with Alex Smith, who's a great dude, my colleague at ESPN, and he read the book, and he's in it for a couple pages, but he read it, and he was like, there are so many stories, from other quarterbacks that I read that I felt like were exactly my experience. And that was my goal with it, to try to show, what this is like from every angle, and, let the reader understand that, look, if this is something you could have done well, this is what life might have been like for you.
I appreciate that you say you were different, as opposed to the non-failed quarterback like Brock. I mean, he failed just at a later stage, right?
Yes, that's very true. If I could have shut off that other voice that was on my shoulder, you're going to throw a pick, do it this way, don't. If I could have shut that voice off, especially at the professional level, maybe I wouldn't be doing this and dealing with Salk every day for the last 17 years of my life.
Well, and that's what I mean. I think that the quarterbacks need to create a kind of ecosystem for themselves where doubt cannot be allowed to come in. And to do that, they have to be willing to be the center of a solar system that revolves around them. And I think back to Andrew Luck. I mean, he's someone that I spent a lot of time with a couple years ago, and, he was uncomfortable with that. He realized that who he had to be a great quarterback was in conflict with who he wanted to be as a person at home, how he wanted to go through the world. And I think that was a lot of the reason why he walked away when he did, was because he didn't really like who he was as a quarterback. And people who end up on the other side as Hall of Famers figured out a way to make peace with that. And that's really an interesting psychological journey.
One of the things I love in the excerpt that we had a chance to read here, which is a lot about Sean Payton and about Bo Nix, but obviously kind of speaks to much more general themes. What did you learn about choosing and finding the right quarterback for a team?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of this book obviously is about what life is like, and it's kind of deep inside the experiences and the heads of these guys. But you can't write a book about quarterbacks without addressing the age-old question, and that's like, why do so many of these guys fail in the NFL? Why does this not work? Why can't people be better at coaching and drafting and mentoring and tutoring them? And I've known Sean Payton for years, and I wanted to talk to him about this, and so we met at a hotel. And, he looks at me and he goes, do you promise this is in March of 2024. And he says, do you promise with every shred of your integrity that you won't share this with anyone? And I'm like, sure, yes. And he pulls out this manila folder, and it has all these statistics, this algorithm that he put together for all of the quarterbacks that are considered the first-round guys in the draft that year. And it was like a failure index. He wanted to try to judge processing speed, which everyone knows is like quite a bit different from college to the NFL. And it's like, that's the golden goose for talent evaluation. It's like, is there a predictive measure for it? And Sean, as a quarterback, he was good. He played professionally, but he struggled with like the processing and the multitasking. Like, he could throw the ball, but he struggled with all the things that Drew Brees and Peyton Manning and Patrick Mahomes and all these guys do so well. And so he wanted to find a formula to kind of address that inefficiency. And also it was a little autobiographical for him. And when he ran all these numbers, Bo Nix came out by far the most efficient quarterback out of the group. And I think that he used the formula to narrow the selections and then use his experiences with Nix in the scouting process to, to confirm all of his suspicions.
It kind of strikes me reading it that a big part of, at least for Sean, is avoiding the negative as opposed to just achieving the positive. And I would have expected that from Bill Belichick, from maybe even Pete Carroll, who was really against his quarterbacks making mistakes. But thinking about the Sean Payton offenses with Drew Brees and the just sheer volume of passes and yards, I don't know, that kind of jumped out and surprised me a little bit. And even the way he's measuring negative plays is a little different than we might think.
Totally. And like, it's essentially like a failure index. It's like, how often do these guys fail? Are they sacked? Do they take a negative play, or do they, God forbid, have a turnover? And, that's what he wanted to look at. And, for what it's worth, Caleb Williams' numbers were horrible. We're the worst of all of the first-round guys. And, I think Caleb's going to be a good NFL quarterback. We'll see, like, how he does this year. But it's just one man's idea. But he's someone who has, he's one of the best offensive minds of his generation, if not ever. And, this was how he tried to, address and answer for that age-old question, which is, how do you evaluate a college quarterback's NFL potential?
Mm-hmm. Any Seth Wickersham here with us. Awesome. This is just wheelhouse stuff for Salk and I, both the psychology of it, the position. It is front and center here in Seattle, pretty spoiled, really, with Matt Hasselbeck and Russell Wilson for nearly 2 decades. And even Geno, had a resurgence. And Sam last year had a resurgence. I'm curious, is there any chapter, any anecdote on that? Why we have seen some of these guys that were quote-unquote busts and failed in other markets find a resurgence in a home the way that Sam did in Minnesota and Geno has the last couple of years in Seattle?
So that's a fascinating point, and it's one that I've thought a lot about, and I actually cut a chapter about it because, like, I couldn't include every single thought I had ever had on quarterbacks, but what you're touching on is fascinating that's happening right now, and it's like this entire economy of quarterbacks that – remember, Caleb Williams and Caleb's dad wanted him to have some agency. I wrote about it in the book over where he was picked because they know how much that matters. That you have, who drafts you has a huge, huge impact on your future, and you have no control over that. And I think that what we're seeing is a bunch of guys like Darnold, like Baker to a certain extent, definitely like Geno, who were drafted into situations that were historically poor, managed to survive So they got broken in those situations. They managed to survive. They managed to go to places where they can take a little bit of a reset, learn from some smart coaches, and then when they get their shot again, it's like the game has slowed down enough and they kind of understand things in a way that they weren't able to do so before. And it gives them another life. And I think that that's something that's really interesting, because for the longest time, if someone was a bust with the team that they were drafted by, I mean, they were out of the NFL. It was gone. And I think that that situation has changed quite a bit. And I think it's kind of, again, it's a big reflection on how few people can evaluate quarterbacks and how few people can coach them.
Well, I would say this too, Seth.
Will Levis, for instance, I think could be one of those guys. I mean, he had some success his first year, and he got hurt. He has to get his shoulder right. But if he could go someplace, assuming he leaves Tennessee, where he can work with a coach who knows offense, he might be one of those guys who could reemerge in that kind of ilk.
Well, it's really good timing, because just this week, Sean Payton talking about some of these things publicly in the Denver market, and he doesn't mind taking a shot at the league, at Roger, at other owners. And he said something that Mike Mayock said to Salk and I in the lead up to the draft in March. Mike, off of experience, I think, with the Raiders and the NFL and all his years around it, and Sean obviously still in it, they both said the same thing. And that is 20 to 25 teams have hope right now in training camp, but got no chance, because there's no ownership. There's no alignment with ownership. There's no commitment really from ownership to have alignment throughout the organization. So as you kind of elevate from just the individual of the quarterback position to the collective of the league in these different environments, in your life experience, Seth, around all these teams and organizations, do you buy that there's 20 teams that get this wrong, and they get it wrong because from the top down, ownership-wise, it's just dysfunctional?
Absolutely. I mean, Bill, with all respect to Sean and to Mike, Bill Walsh said that. He said, he always said we're competing against 8 teams. Those are the teams that have their act together. And, the rest of them don't. And, Belichick, I think, echoed that quite a bit. I mean, I wrote a book on the Patriots, but, you go back to his football life and he's talking about, how poor the Patriots were the season prior against the top teams in the AFC. So it really didn't, matter that they, won 11 games or whatever it was. They couldn't beat the teams that they needed to beat. And, and I think that, again, quarterback is a position that fascinates America most. I get into how it became fascinating, which really is interesting, and it goes back to 1885. But it's the position that Americans are fascinated with most and know the least about. And I think especially from a mental point of view, the things that you talked about, how you deal with stress, doubt, the ego involved that you have to have. I sat down with Steve Young and we started listing all of the hats that a quarterback has to wear. And I think that we stopped at 24, which was insane. I mean, that's different than playing, center field for the Yankees.
Does Russ factor into this story at all?
I didn't. So I picked my characters. They were somewhat subjective, but I picked them either based on stories that I simply had to tell because they were cultural archetypes like Unitas or Namath, right? Or stories that I was personally fascinated with. And Russ didn't factor into that. It has nothing to do with him, but it just, when I narrowed down the people that I wanted to really laser in on, he just wasn't one of them.
Okay, so I kind of have two things here, and they're related because I'm looking for some long-term advice for us as radio hosts, because this year we're going to be judging Sam Darnold every day, every week. Certainly, that's part of the gig, and we'll see what transpires with him. So I guess the first question is, what should we be looking for with Sam Darnold? To judge him and figure out whether or not he's capable of being the franchise quarterback here in Seattle. If he falls short of that and the Seahawks find themselves back in the mix to potentially draft somebody, we'll see what happens with Jalen Milroe, but if they're back in the mix, what's the number one thing that they should be looking for then and that we should be calling for here on the radio saying, no, you need to make sure you get the guy who does X?
Oh, man. I mean, I would be really, really rich if I could answer those questions with certainty. I think that, look, I think that you judge quarterbacks in a lot of different ways, but ultimately it's points scored. I mean, it's not statistics, even though that's part of it. I think it's points scored. So do the Seahawks have a potent offense? I think that that's the main thing. And do they have components that defenses consistently struggle to shut down? And then I think that, when you look beyond Darnold to whoever, the next person might be, I mean, and I do spend more time on this in the book than just the Sean Payton stuff, but I think we're evaluating college quarterbacks in a game that fundamentally just doesn't resemble the NFL. That's another problem with it. I mean, the hash marks in college create so much space for college quarterbacks, and the NFL game is kind of played in the middle of the field, whereas college isn't. And so I think that Caleb Williams, his numbers last year throwing over the middle, I mean, I think the coaches thought that he was tentative about pulling the trigger, throwing over the middle, because he hadn't done it very much in college. And I think that when you're looking at scouting college quarterbacks, there's two components. There's the pure arm talent. And even though we say, this guy can make all the throws, we really don't know until they actually do it, and they do it again and again, and they do it in the highest leverage moments. And then there's a question of handling mentally, being able to handle everything that comes with being an NFL quarterback. And, I think that that again is something that, if there was a formula for that, it would be great. I mean, I think that Jalen Hurts is somebody who you can tell that he kind of lives in his own world. And I think that there's probably, it comes off as a little Zen-like at times and maybe a little confusing, but I think that that helps him, and it helps him deal with something when he's the quarterback of a football team and is responsible for a lot of things that he has no control over. I think that how they choose to handle that type of tension and stress and pressure would be the things I'd be looking at.
Well, this is my mind is just, as you can imagine, racing, Salk, and I've been doodling a lot of thoughts here. And I didn't realize Seth and I are kindred spirits. I mean, I was from Southeast Alaska and Puyallup. He was from Alaska. What town up in Alaska did you quarterback in?
Anchorage, yeah.
Yep. So, we go way, way back. I land on this. Yeah. I think I land on this one, Seth, as much as anything. And after I say
all of us subarctic quarterbacks.
That's right. To answer Salk's question, what are we looking for? I think I'm landing on this, and I'm living a life experience. It's really unique right now, watching my son kind of develop into a quarterback, and my own life experience. I land on the fact that I don't think you can be a pleaser and be a quarterback today.
Mm-hmm.
All these personality traits, these different, the way you framed it earlier of Andrew Luck and, the framework around you, the bubble, whatever. But I'd be really curious if you think back to all these different guys that you have interviewed from 1885 on, how many of them by nature and their personality were pleasers? Because I am, and I was, and it got to a point in a crossroads in my career where that ended me. You can't do that and perform at this level. I think that is an attribute that we'll study, I think, more and more in time at the position.
Alex Smith talks about this. He was valedictorian of his high school class. And when he got to the NFL, he thought he had to be perfect. He thought he had to be Joe Montana, Steve Young, and Peyton Manning all wrapped into one. And football was playing for the 49ers was the first time he had ever really failed at something. And his sense of self, he told me he had no sense of self during those years. And, there were some outside factors also, but I think what you're saying is right, because he wanted to please so badly. And because of that, I think that he was riddled with a certain amount of insecurity that really haunted him for a long time, maybe until Jim Harbaugh got there.
Yep.
It's cool. I'm excited to read the book. Just a couple weeks away. It's called American Kings, a biography of the quarterback. It comes out September 9th. I assume you can buy it at that point everywhere, Amazon or local booksellers or anywhere you like to find. If you're a Kindle reader or whatever, it'll be everywhere. Seth, we appreciate it. Always love your work, even when we trash it and say that it's all lies and made up and you have no real source. No, sorry, that's other people who do it. Exactly. Sorry about that. You and Don and the rest of the group, we love what you guys do. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you guys do read it, I'll happily come back and talk about it. It's got a lot of great stuff. What it's like to be a quarterback, what it's like to be married to a quarterback, divorced from one.
Oh.
It's really, hopefully.
Are these all experiences you've had, or just these are through interviews? Wow.
Thankfully, it's all other people's.
Okay. Hey, appreciate it, man. Let's do that. Let's talk after September 9th. Once we have a chance to read it, we'll have you back, and we'll talk again. Thanks, buddy.
Have a good day, you guys.